June 12, 1943. The morning heat on Bougainville airfield in the northern Solomons pressed down like a damp shroud. Japanese mechanics, stripped to their waists, wiped sweat from their brows as they readied the A6M Zeros for another patrol. The smell of oil mixed with sea salt carried in from the nearby coast, while cicadas buzzed in the distance. For the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was still familiar ground. They had ruled these skies for 2 years, outmaneuvering every clumsy American machine that dared rise against them. Their aircraft, the Zero, was legendary, its turning circle tighter than anything the enemy could field. Few doubted that superiority would continue. By mid-morning, the Zeros lifted into the heavy air, their engines droning like angry hornets. A patrol of 4 spotted shapes glinting below the haze, American fighters approaching from the east. At first, the Japanese pilots dismissed them. They had grown accustomed to Wildcats and Airacobras, aircraft they could spiral around with contemptuous ease. Yet as the two formations closed, unease spread. The newcomers had broad, bent wings, a strange gull-like profile that broke the smooth symmetry of flight. Their climb rate was astonishing, the gull-winged machines rising through the clouds as if pulled by some invisible hand. The Japanese pilots tightened their turns, banking into the vertical spirals that had always shaken pursuit. But this time the trick failed. The American fighters rose with them, faster, heavier, still closing. The Imperial flyers pulled steeper into the sky, straining for altitude, but the strange machines only narrowed the gap. Their leader, flying the vaunted A6M Model 22 with a 1,130 horsepower Sakae engine, watched in disbelief as the American craft, later identified as the Chance Vought F4U Corsair, outclimbed his Zero. Where once American aircraft had faltered in the vertical, now they surged upward with terrifying inevitability. Details burned themselves into memory. The Corsairs Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine unleashed more than 2,000 horsepower, nearly doubling the thrust of the Sakae. Its top speed exceeded 400 miles per hour, 50 faster than the Zero at altitude. Even the initial production runs, just beginning to reach Marine squadrons in the Solomons, showed performance numbers that rewrote the balance. Against this raw force, Japanese agility was no longer enough. The hunter had become the hunted. One Japanese pilot who survived later wrote of the sudden terror of seeing a foreign machine rise where no foreign machine had climbed before. That terror was more than personal. It was a psychological blow to an entire service. The aura of invincibility surrounding the Zero cracked that day, replaced with the gnawing realization that a new adversary had arrived. The Pacific Air War would no longer be fought on Japanese terms. The memory of that first encounter lingered among those who escaped. It marked the threshold of a new era, when the balance of technology tilted westward and American pilots would seize the initiative. To understand how such a reversal came to be, we must trace the Corsair's path from design tables in Connecticut to the embattled runways of the Pacific Islands, where its legend was forged in fire and steel. December 7, 1941 marked the beginning of a long and bitter truth in the Pacific. Japan ruled the skies. In the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy's A6M Zero cut across the vast ocean theater like a predator without rival. Introduced only the year before, the Zero seemed to defy the expectations of Western designers. Its range exceeded 1,100 miles, an astonishing figure for a single-engine fighter, and its agility allowed it to carve tight spirals in the sky that no American machine could hope to match. To Allied crews who climbed into their cockpits in the Philippines, Malaya, or the Coral Sea, the Zero was not just an airplane. It was the symbol of a new, terrifying imbalance. The numbers told the story. During the opening weeks of 1942, Wildcat pilots of the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps often faced kill ratios of 5-to-1 or worse. Reports from the Philippines described entire flights of American P-40s torn from the air in minutes. At Darwin, at Wake, at the fall of Singapore, the same pattern repeated. Wherever Zeros appeared, Allied resistance crumbled in the skies overhead. Japanese pilots, many veterans of China, flew with calm assurance. Their confidence rested not only on skill but on a machine whose lightweight design, sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel, tanks, gave it performance Western engineers had not imagined possible. This dominance spread beyond tactics into the realm of psychology. Civilians across Asia came to believe Japanese airpower unstoppable, a conviction reinforced by propaganda films showing Zeros darting through clouds while enemy fighters spun downward in flames. American crews, meanwhile, carried the dread into battle. They learned quickly that to engage a Zero in a turning fight was suicide. Never dogfight a Jap became the grim lesson passed in ready rooms. Instead, survival depended on diving steeply to gain speed and escaping back toward friendly lines. Even then, many failed to outrun their pursuers. Yet within this aura of invincibility, small cracks began to appear. At the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, and more dramatically at Midway in June, American carrier groups showed that careful coordination, disciplined formations, and a willingness to absorb losses could blunt Japanese superiority. At Midway, though many Wildcats were lost, U.S. Navy dive bombers struck a blow from which the Imperial fleet never fully recovered. These clashes revealed that technology alone could not secure victory. Strategy, radar direction, and pilot training mattered as well. Still, at the level of one-on-one combat, the Zero remained a terror. American pilots, even those who returned from successful missions, admitted that facing the A6M in close quarters was like staring into a trap they could not escape. By late 1942, the Solomons campaign added new layers to this struggle. In the skies over Guadalcanal, the Zero proved it could still dictate the terms of battle. American flyers grew inventive, using what became known as the thatch weave, a cooperative maneuver designed to counter the Zero's turn. This innovation saved lives, but it underscored the reality. Only by outthinking the enemy could Allied aircraft survive. The Zero's raw performance had not yet been eclipsed. As 1943 dawned, however, the tide of design was already shifting. In American factories, engineers had pursued a different philosophy, one of brute strength, speed, and firepower. Where Japanese design favored lightness and maneuverability, U.S. designers increasingly turned toward power plants capable of overwhelming an adversary through climb rate and velocity. The Chance Vought F4U Corsair, with its distinctive inverted gull wings and massive Pratt Whitney engine, represented the culmination of this effort. For now it remained in limited service, but its arrival promised to change the very terms of aerial combat. Thus, the Pacific balance before 1943 was one of contrasts, dominance in the present for Japan, but a storm building quietly across the ocean. Pilots of the Zero still believed themselves invincible, but the day was approaching when their spirals and turns would no longer grant escape. The next chapter of the air war would be written not by maneuver alone, but by raw speed and the will to climb higher, faster, and deadlier than before. In the summer of 1938, as the world edged closer to war, the United States Navy issued a challenge that seemed almost audacious. It demanded a new carrier-based fighter that could exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight, a speed benchmark that few engineers believed possible for a naval aircraft weighed down by folding wings, heavy landing gear, and the stresses of arrested carrier landings. Most fighters of the era barely reached the mid-300s. Yet at Chance Vaught's design offices in Connecticut, Chief Engineer Rex Beisel took the requirement as an opportunity to build something unlike anything the Navy had flown before. At the heart of his design lay a gamble: to build the airframe around Pratt and Whitney's experimental R-2800 double-wasp radial engine. This 18-cylinder, two-row powerhouse promised over 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the output of engines driving existing carrier fighters. Its sheer size created new problems. The massive propeller it required stretched over 13 feet in diameter, too large for standard landing gear. To prevent the aircraft from teetering on impossibly long legs, Basil's team introduced a radical solution: wings that bent downward from the fuselage before angling upward again. This inverted gull-wing design allowed shorter, stronger landing gear, while also smoothing airflow where the wing met the fuselage. It became the Corsair's unmistakable silhouette. The first prototype, designated XF4U-1, took to the skies on May 29, 1940. Test pilot Lyman Bullard lifted the dark blue machine from the runway at Stratford, Connecticut, and stunned observers by pushing it past 400 miles per hour in level flight. In that moment, the Corsair became the first U.S. single-engine fighter to achieve such speed. fulfilling the Navy's bold requirement and setting a new standard for combat aircraft. Engineers and officials alike realized they had something extraordinary, a fighter that matched or surpassed Europe's fastest designs while retaining the ruggedness required for naval service. Yet speed was not the only measure of success, and early trials exposed the Corsair's flaws. The enormous nose, stretched to house the R-2800, blocked forward visibility on landing approaches. Test pilots reported difficulty judging the deck, leading to hard touchdowns. Worse, the long, springy landing gear caused the aircraft to bounce and skip across runways and carrier decks. In Navy trials, some landings ended in wreckage. The Corsair's unmatched power came with an equally unmatched challenge: to tame its aggression for the narrow steel decks of American carriers. Despite these shortcomings, the aircraft's promise was undeniable. By 1942, the Corsair entered production, equipped with 650 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in its wings and able to climb to over 37,000 feet. Its top speed reached nearly 417 miles per hour, and its combat radius exceeded 500 miles, enough to escort bombers or hunt enemy patrols across the Pacific expanse. Compared to the Zero, faster in climb, better armed, armored, and protected by self-sealing fuel tanks, the Corsair embodied a fundamentally different design philosophy. Where Japan had embraced lightness and maneuverability, the Americans now turned to brute force survivability and technological audacity. Initially, the Navy restricted the Corsair to Marine Corps land bases, where long coral runways provided safer conditions than carrier decks. From Guadalcanal to Espiritu Santo, the Marines welcomed the new machine, learning to harness its ferocity and building tactics around its climb and dive. In these early deployments, the Corsair's reputation began to spread. Pilots spoke of its raw strength, of the way its double Wasp engine seemed to drag the aircraft upward against gravity's will. It was less forgiving than the Zero, but in skilled hands it promised dominance. By the time 1943 arrived, the Corsair had matured into a weapon of transformation. Its gull wings and massive radial engine signaled a new age in American fighter design, one where horsepower, altitude, and armor would finally counter the Zero's grace. What began as a bold engineering experiment had become the harbinger of a decisive shift in air power, preparing the stage for a clash in which design philosophies would be tested in blood and fire over the islands of the Pacific. January 1943 opened with Guadalcanal still smoldering from months of relentless fighting. Henderson Field, the rough strip of coral and pierced steel planking carved from the jungle, remained both prize and lifeline. For months, American Marines and Navy pilots had flown Wildcats and Airacobras from its battered runways, straining to keep Japanese bombers and Zeros at bay. Losses had been high, and the men who survived carried the fatigue of endless alerts, bombings, and night raids by the Tokyo Express. But with the new year came a new arrival, a machine unlike any the Solomons had yet seen. Painted dark blue, broad-shouldered with its bent wings stretched like a predator preparing to strike, the F4U Corsair rolled onto the field. The Marines of VMF 124 would be its first combat custodians. On February 13, 1943, the squadron took to the air for its baptism of fire. The target was a Japanese formation approaching the island, escorted as always by Zeros. The men of the Imperial Navy had no reason to expect trouble. For months they had outturned every American fighter and punished the defenders of Guadalcanal with contemptuous ease. Yet this day would be different. As the two forces converged, Japanese pilots attempted the familiar spirals and sharp climbing turns that had shaken Wildcats from pursuit. Instead, they found their predators clinging to their tails, climbing faster and surging higher. The Corsair's 2,000 horsepower Pratt Whitney engine delivered thrust the Zero could not match. In vertical climbs, the Americans pulled away with startling ease. Then came the dives. Heavy for a fighter, the Corsair translated weight into devastating speed. In one pass, it could dive through a formation and still have the energy to climb away before the Zeros could answer. Japanese pilots, accustomed to choosing the moment of disengagement, suddenly found themselves trapped. Breaking away meant exposing their bellies to 650 caliber guns, while diving for escape only brought the thunder of a Corsair still accelerating behind them. That February, Corsairs of VMF 124 downed multiple Zeros in a single clash, The results quickly whispered across Henderson's perimeter. For the first time, Marines stood under a sky where Japanese dominance faltered. The effect was immediate and deeply psychological. For American pilots, long resigned to surviving through teamwork and evasive tactics, the Corsair was liberation. They could now fight aggressively, secure in the knowledge that their machine would not betray them the moment a Zero tried to turn inside. Reports from Guadalcanal spoke of pilots returning with a newfound swagger, of confidence, replacing the tight-lipped fatalism that had colored earlier months. The Corsair did not eliminate losses, far from it, but it gave men the sense that they could meet the Zero on equal, even superior terms. For the Japanese, these encounters were a warning. Intelligence officers, reviewing combat reports, were stunned to learn of American fighters climbing past the Zero. This was not supposed to be possible. The A6M had reigned since 1940 as the supreme dogfighter of the Pacific, and Japanese doctrine assumed it would continue to dictate terms. Yet over the Solomons, their veterans now faced an enemy aircraft that could break their vertical tactics and run them down in a dive. What they once considered their unassailable strengths had become vulnerabilities. By March 1943, word spread across both sides that Guadalcanal's skies had shifted. The Americans, bolstered by the Corsair, had seized the initiative in the air. The Zero was still lethal in a turning fight, but the era when its dominance could terrorize entire squadrons was passing. The Marines of VMF 124, hardened by the mud and malaria of Henderson Field, had given the new fighter its trial by fire, and the results could not be ignored. Japan's high command, faced with mounting losses and dwindling numbers of veteran flyers, began to question whether outdated machines could bear the weight of a war that had already begun to favor American industry and innovation. Thus, the Corsair's first blood on Guadalcanal was more than a series of victories. It was proof that engineering and persistence could shatter myths of invincibility. In the Solomons' choking heat, where palm fronds rattled with every passing shell, the balance of air power tilted. And from that moment forward, Japan's flyers would never again look down on their enemies with certainty. By the middle of 1943, whispers of a new American fighter began spreading through Japanese units, stationed at Rabaul, Bougainville, and the Northern Solomons. Pilots who returned from combat spoke with unease, describing a machine with bent gull-shaped wings that climbed with frightening power. These were not the clumsy Wildcats or Airacobras they had once dismissed. This new opponent could match them in maneuver, outpace them in speed, and dive with such ferocity that disengagement often proved impossible. Reports circulated that in vertical combat the Zero stalled while the American machine simply rose higher, as if pulled into the sun by unseen force. The first reaction from staff officers was disbelief. For years, the A6M Zero had been the unrivaled master of Pacific skies. With its long-range, feather-light frame and exquisite agility, it had humiliated the West from Malaya to Midway. The notion that an American aircraft could suddenly shatter that dominance seemed implausible. Yet the evidence mounted. Squadrons at Rabaul filed combat reports, noting repeated encounters where Zeros could neither catch their adversary nor escape its pursuit. Gun camera film from American raids confirmed the losses. Even the most veteran pilots, men who had fought since China, admitted privately that they faced an opponent against which skill alone might no longer suffice. Engineers and intelligence officers scrambled to piece together the identity of this threat. Salvage teams combed jungle clearings and shallow lagoons for wreckage, but the new American fighters' raw speed often left little behind. When fragments were recovered, sections of twisted wing, a shattered cowling, they revealed armor plates and heavy machine gun mounts alien to Japanese design philosophy. Here was an aircraft built for survival as much as for maneuver, a machine willing to trade elegance for brute force. Analysts in Tokyo concluded that the Allies had introduced a model centered around a massive radial engine, its propeller driven by a power plant producing more than 2,000 horsepower. It was an order of magnitude beyond the lightweight Sakae engines that powered the Zero. The psychological toll grew heavier with each engagement. Veteran pilots, once serene in the belief that no Western machine could challenge their turn radius, now returned shaken. They spoke of dogfights where their trusted spirals were countered, where every climb seemed futile against an enemy that only grew larger in the gun sight. The Japanese Navy's training emphasized initiative and aggression, but these virtues faltered when men began to doubt the superiority of their aircraft. Squadron diaries note a decline in morale, an exhaustion that could not be cured by experience alone. Commanders sought countermeasures. Tactics shifted toward ambush and surprise, urging pilots to strike from above and disengage quickly before the gull-winged fighters could respond. Extended engagements, once the hallmark of Japanese dominance, now risked disaster. These adjustments delayed the inevitable, but could not alter the underlying truth. The design philosophy that had been revolutionary in 1940 was obsolete by 1943. The Zero, once an unmatched predator, had become vulnerable prey to an enemy whose industry and engineering had leapfrogged ahead. Reports sent back to Tokyo carried an undercurrent of alarm. The Corsair, as intelligence finally named it, represented not only a technical threat but an industrial one. The United States was already producing thousands of aircraft each month, with assembly lines at Vought, Goodyear and Brewster feeding a growing flood of machines. If one fighter could blunt the Zero's advantages, then mass production of such fighters could overwhelm Japan entirely. Pilots, engineers and commanders alike recognized the grim implication. No matter their skill, they were now fighting against a tide of horsepower and numbers they could never hope to equal. Thus, the shift from confidence to alarm marked more than a tactical adjustment. It was the first clear acknowledgement that Japan's air arm had passed its peak. The gull-winged monster had forced recognition that the war in the air was tilting, not through chance but through the relentless logic of industrial might. By the spring of 1943, the contest in the skies of the Pacific was no longer defined solely by tactics and pilot skill. It had become a struggle of factories, assembly lines and logistics, where Japan clung to limited resources and increasingly battered production centers. The United States unleashed the full power of its industrial arsenal. The Corsair stood at the center of this transformation, a machine not only formidable in combat, but built in numbers that staggered the imagination. Chance Vaught's plant in Stratford, Connecticut, was the first to take on the challenge. Its hangars echoed day and night, with the thunder of riveting guns and the whine of engines being tested. By 1943, rows of Corsairs rolled off the line each month, each painted in dark sea blue and readied for shipment to the Pacific. Yet demand quickly exceeded the capacity of a single factory. The Navy turned to subcontractors, and Goodyear in Akron, Ohio, along with Brewster on Long Island, joined the effort. Between them, these three manufacturers would eventually produce over 12,500 Corsairs before the war's end, an achievement that dwarfed anything Imperial Japan could hope to match. The scale of this effort extended beyond airframes. Pratt Whitney's R-2800 double wasp engines, each a marvel of American engineering, were built in their own dedicated plants and crated by the thousands. Shipped across rail networks to the coasts and then across the ocean, they arrived at forward depots, where mechanics assembled them into aircraft waiting at island bases. American logistics ensured that no squadron was left idle for want of parts. Spare propellers, wings and instruments traveled in the same convoys as fuel and ammunition, creating a seamless chain that kept Corsair units operational even in the most remote atolls. By contrast, Japanese production sagged under mounting strain. Aluminum supplies dwindled, rubber grew scarce, and by 1944 U.S. bombing raids began to devastate aircraft plants in Nagoya and other centers. Where American factories added shifts and expanded assembly halls, Japan was forced to cut corners, producing aircraft with less protection, poorer materials, and in drastically smaller numbers. For every Corsair that rolled onto an island airstrip, only a fraction of a Zero could be fielded. The imbalance widened with every passing month. On bases such as Espiritu Santo and Bougainville, this industrial tide became visible in the rhythm of operations. Squadrons rotated in and out with barely a pause, fresh aircraft and pilots taking the place of those worn down by combat. The Japanese, by contrast, could not easily replace veteran flyers, and each loss struck deeper into the core of their experience. American Marines and Navy aviators began to notice the shift. Where once the Zeros appeared in overwhelming numbers, now it was the Corsairs that seemed endless. The psychological weight of this reality bore down on the Japanese. Even when a Zero managed to claim a kill, the victory felt hollow. For the next day, another Corsair would rise to take its place. This relentless pressure reflected the broader American strategy of total war. The Corsair was not just an aircraft, it was a symbol of a nation's capacity to produce, to innovate, and to sustain. Every rivet hammered into its frame in Connecticut or Ohio represented the hand of a worker, contributing to victory thousands of miles away. Each crate of engines arriving at Espiritu Santo carried with it the assurance that the fight could continue without pause. For Japanese pilots, this industrial juggernaut eroded more than material strength. It eroded hope. The days of dictating combat, of believing in the unassailable supremacy of the Zero, were gone. In their place was the grim knowledge that no matter how skillfully they fought, they faced not only a superior machine, but an endless stream of them. Aggression gave way to defense, confidence to resignation. The arsenal of democracy had taken shape, and in the bent wings of the Corsair it found one of its sharpest blades. The shadow of Guadalcanal lingered into the autumn of 1943, but with the island secure, the Allies pressed their advantage. The next steps of the island-hopping campaign would test not only soldiers and sailors, but the new generation of aircraft that had proven itself in the Solomons. The Chance Vought F4U Corsair, hardened by its trial above Henderson Field, now began to spread across the Pacific like a tide. Its bent wings and thundering engine became a familiar sight over every new battlefield, marking a shift in the balance of air power that could no longer be ignored. Bougainville came first. In November 1943, as Marines waded ashore at Cape Torokina, Corsairs roared overhead in sweeping formations. Their task was clear: intercept Japanese bombers before they could strike the fragile beachhead and the transports offshore. Reports from the landings describe how Corsairs climbed above the humid haze, meeting incoming Betty bombers, escorted by Zeros. In dogfights that once would have favored Japan, the results now tilted decisively. Corsairs tore into the formations, scattering bombers before they reached Allied lines. Marines on the ground recalled looking up to see dark blue silhouettes carving contrails across the sky, a reassurance that air cover was no longer in doubt. For Japanese pilots, the shock deepened. Their familiar tactics of escort and diversion could no longer guarantee success. From Bougainville, the campaign moved into the Marshalls in early 1944, a new proving ground not only for the Corsair's speed and climb, but for its adaptability. The U.S. Navy had once questioned whether the aircraft could safely operate from carriers. Its long nose and unforgiving landings had delayed its deployment at sea. But by the Marshalls, skilled pilots and refined training had overcome those fears. Corsairs began to fly from fleet carriers alongside Hellcats, expanding their reach. Task Force 58 carried them into action, their missions shifting fluidly between air superiority sweeps and close support for Marines seizing atolls. Here the Corsair showed it could be not only a predator of enemy fighters, but a hammer against fortified positions, diving low to strafe bunkers and suppress defenders with 650 caliber guns. By mid-1944, the island-hopping offensive reached the Marianas, the linchpin of Japan's defensive perimeter. Saipan, Guam, and Tinian lay ahead, targets whose capture would bring Tokyo itself within range of American bombers. Corsairs formed part of the immense air umbrella that shielded the landings. In the skies over Saipan, they tangled with dwindling numbers of Zeros, proving again that Japan could no longer contest the vertical dimension of battle. Over Tinian, Corsairs intercepted raids aimed at halting the beachhead, destroying attackers before they could threaten ships and transports. With every engagement, the pattern repeated. Where once Japanese squadrons had dictated the terms of combat, they now found themselves hunted, their losses irreplaceable. The impact went beyond tactical victories. Each campaign underscored the growing inevitability of Allied dominance. Japanese aviators, still brave and skilled, returned from missions shaken, writing in their reports that the enemy's new fighters seemed endless, their climb insurmountable, their speed overwhelming. American crews, meanwhile, grew ever more confident. The Corsair, once doubted as too dangerous for carriers and too heavy for nimble combat, had become a weapon pilots trusted with their lives. The spread of the Corsair across these fronts mirrored the larger Allied strategy itself, an inexorable closing of the noose around Japan. Bougainville, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Each step narrowed the ring, each battle further eroded Japanese strength in the air. By the summer of 1944, the stage was set for even larger clashes. Ahead lay encounters where entire Japanese air groups would rise into the sky, only to be annihilated within hours. The Corsair, alongside the Hellcat, would be at the forefront of this decisive shift, heralding the twilight of Japanese aerial resistance. By 1943, the battle for the Pacific skies was no longer fought only in bursts of gunfire and contrails. It was fought in the minds of the men who climbed into their cockpits each dawn, and in this unseen arena, the Corsair struck with as much force as its 650 caliber guns. The A6M Zero, once the terror of Allied pilots, had lost its aura of inevitability. In its place came a creeping dread, carried back to Japanese bases on the lips of exhausted survivors, who spoke of an enemy that climbed higher, dove faster, and pressed home attacks with relentless aggression. The psychological effect of this reversal was profound. In the early years of the war, Japanese airmen had flown with supreme confidence. They taunted their enemies in combat, daring them into tight spirals, where the Zero's light frame and agility could not be matched. But now those spirals became traps for the Japanese themselves. A Corsair could follow them into the vertical, closing the gap with terrifying speed. What had once been their advantage was now their weakness, and every pilot knew it. Reports from Rabaul described veteran flyers abandoning vertical climbs altogether, choosing instead to flee low over the waves, a tactic born of desperation rather than doctrine. For the Americans, the change was equally striking. Pilots who had entered the war resigned to survival tactics, hit and run, never dogfight, began to relish the clash. In the Corsair, they discovered not just an aircraft, but a weapon that rewarded aggression. Combat reports from Marine squadrons in the Solomons and Marshalls spoke with new confidence, describing enemy fighters as meat on the table once caught in the Corsair's sights. Morale surged as squadrons returned from missions boasting victories once unthinkable. This was not arrogance, but the natural consequence of trust. Men trusted their machines, and that trust gave them the courage to seize the initiative. The gulf between these two mindsets widened with every battle. Japanese squadrons, depleted of veterans, filled their ranks with younger recruits who entered combat, already doubting their chances. They had heard the stories of Zeros shredded in dives, of formations broken by a single pass from bent-wing fighters. Fear and hesitation, once alien to the Imperial Navy's aviators, began to creep into their reflexes. Split-second decisions in the air were slowed by second-guessing, and in combat such hesitation was fatal. This erosion of confidence was as decisive as any material loss. Wars are fought with machines, but they are won with belief. The Corsair stripped Japan of the conviction that had carried its pilots through the first 2 years of conquest. No longer did they look down on their adversaries as clumsy and doomed. Now each climb risked disaster. Each engagement brought the specter of annihilation. For the Americans, the reverse was true. Every flight reinforced the idea that they could not only match but outfight the enemy. By late 1943 and into 1944, the psychological tide had fully turned. The Corsair gave Allied pilots the freedom to fight on their own terms, dictating the tempo of battle. Japanese flyers, once masters of the initiative, were reduced to reactive defense. This shift in mindset paved the way for the great air clashes to come. As Japan's leaders faced dwindling options, they would gamble on massed attacks, believing that only overwhelming numbers might restore balance. Yet those attacks would collide with an American force now emboldened, confident, and armed with machines that erased any doubt of victory. By 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered a new phase. The Zero still flew from island bases and carriers, but its reign as the master of the skies was broken. The Corsair, together with the Hellcat, dictated the terms of combat. This shift did more than change the outcome of individual dogfights. It reshaped both Japanese and American strategy, determining the course of entire campaigns. For the Japanese, the recognition of inferiority led to increasingly desperate measures. Surprise and ambush became the favored tools, as commanders sought to exploit fleeting moments before American fighters could bring their superior climb and speed to bear. Massed formations were ordered in an attempt to overwhelm defenses, a tactic that once might have brought results but now often led to disaster. In June 1944, these measures reached their breaking point during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, As Japanese carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft toward the American fleet, U.S. fighters rose to meet them. Hellcats, flying in great numbers, took the lion's share of the kills. But Corsairs operating from land bases across the Marianas contributed by suppressing Japanese sorties and denying reinforcements. By the time the battle ended, over 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed in a single day, an event that would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For the Americans, the Corsairs' strengths encouraged new tactics. The old lessons of Guadalcanal, never turn with a zero, always dive away if threatened, gave way to confidence in the boom and zoom. This strategy emphasized diving attacks at high speed, then climbing rapidly back to altitude before the enemy could respond. It was a style of fighting tailor-made for the Corsairs' horsepower and ruggedness. Pilots learned to exploit altitude as a weapon, choosing when to strike and when to disengage, while denying the zero the extended, turning duels it required to prevail. Combat reports from 1944 are filled with descriptions of Corsairs dropping through formations of Japanese aircraft, striking in bursts of fire, and then climbing away almost untouched. The strategic consequences of these engagements were profound. Every battle further depleted Japan's pool of experienced pilots. By 1944, the Imperial Navy was fielding increasing numbers of recruits with minimal training, men who often faced their first combat against American veterans flying superior machines. The losses mounted irretrievably. Where once Japan could replace aircraft but not pilots, now it could replace neither in sufficient numbers. Each encounter with Corsairs and Hellcats accelerated the erosion of the Japanese air arm. This collapse of air power directly enabled the American advance. Amphibious assaults in the Marshalls, Marianas, and later the Philippines could proceed under the protection of overwhelming air superiority. Japanese commanders, who had once counted on fierce aerial resistance, now faced the grim reality that their forces could no longer mount sustained counterattacks. The Corsair, though one part of a broader arsenal, was a crucial instrument in this outcome. Its combination of climb, speed, and firepower provided the cutting edge that made U.S. air dominance unchallengeable. The lessons of these years extended beyond the Pacific. Air doctrine for the remainder of the conflict and for the post-war era would enshrine the principles demonstrated in combat. That power, altitude, and speed were decisive, and that survivability mattered as much as agility. The Corsair's role in proving these truths cannot be overstated. It was not merely a fighter that won duels. It was a machine that shaped strategy, broke the morale of an adversary, and opened the skies for victory. The Corsair's reputation as a fearsome predator of the Pacific skies was well earned, but its path to dominance was not without obstacles. Beneath its victories lay a series of flaws that threatened, at least in its early years, to limit its potential. Chief among these was its troubled relationship with carrier decks. The Navy had demanded a fighter capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour, and Chance Vought had delivered, but speed came with compromises. The Corsair's long nose, stretched to house the massive R-2800 engine, created blind spots so severe that pilots struggled to judge their approaches. More than one test flight ended in disaster, as the aircraft slammed down off-center or bounced uncontrollably across the deck. Reports of its killer landing gear spread quickly among aviators, and for a time the Navy withheld the Corsair from frontline carrier squadrons, leaving the Marines to prove its worth from the relative safety of land bases. The difficulties extended into the air. Pilots noted that the Corsair's stall characteristics were abrupt and unforgiving. Mishandled, the gull-wing fighter could snap without warning, dropping into rolls that caught inexperienced flyers off guard. Japanese observers noticed these quirks as well. Early combat reports from Rabaul suggested that if a Zero pilot could force his opponent into tight, low-speed turns, the Corsair's vulnerabilities might be exposed. For a moment, it seemed that the bent-wing terror might carry within it fatal flaws, yet American ingenuity proved as formidable as American horsepower. Engineers and squadrons adapted step by step. Modifications to the cockpit canopy improved visibility, giving pilots a better view over the nose. Training emphasized new landing techniques, longer approaches, curved descents that kept the deck in sight until the final flare. By 1944, Navy aviators had mastered the art of taming the Corsair onto a carrier deck, and the aircraft began flying routinely from fleet carriers. What had once been considered too dangerous now became one of the Navy's most trusted tools. Beyond solving its weaknesses, the Corsair's rugged frame invited innovation. The same qualities that made it a terror in air combat, its power, its durability, its heavy armament, made it equally effective in roles beyond dogfighting. Marines on the ground soon learned to call on the Corsair for close air support. Outfitted with bombs and rockets, it dove on bunkers, strafed defensive positions, and blasted supply dumps with a fury that infantrymen welcomed as a lifeline. In the island-hopping campaigns of 1944 and 1945, Corsairs became as familiar to Marines in foxholes as artillery or naval gunfire, circling overhead and delivering precision strikes that softened enemy resistance before each assault. The Japanese, meanwhile, could not mirror this adaptability. The Zero, built upon a fragile philosophy of lightness and agility, lacked the armor and structural strength to carry heavy ordnance or absorb punishment in low-altitude attack runs. Nor did Japan succeed in fielding a true successor with the power to challenge Allied designs. Projects such as the Shiden and Raiden emerged too late and in too few numbers to matter. The Corsair, once a troubled newcomer, continued to grow more versatile while the Zero aged into obsolescence. By late 1944, the transformation was complete. The Corsair was no longer the risky experiment of its debut, but a proven, flexible weapon, fighter, bomber, escort, and ground attacker in one. Its limitations had not disappeared, but they had been overcome by adaptation and ingenuity, while Japan's limitations remained unresolved. This contrast tells a larger truth of the Pacific War, that victory belonged not only to the boldest design, but to the side that could learn, refine, and endure. From this foundation, the Corsair would carry its bent wings into the war's final year, when the battlefields lay not in distant atolls, but at Japan's very doorstep. By the opening months of 1945, the Corsair had become a familiar presence across the Pacific battlefield, its bent wings and thundering radial engine a constant companion to advancing American forces. The machine that had entered combat at Guadalcanal as a troubled newcomer now flew with full authority over the final and bloodiest campaigns of the war. At Iwo Jima in February, Corsairs swept ahead of the invasion fleet, clearing the skies of what few Japanese fighters still dared to rise before shifting their fury downward. They pummeled bunkers, artillery emplacements, and caves with bombs and rockets, softening the island's volcanic defenses for the Marines struggling ashore. In this dual role, guardian of the skies and hammer against the ground, the Corsair revealed its full maturity as a weapon of war. The collapse of Japan's aerial arm was unmistakable. The once vaunted Zero still flew, but now in dwindling numbers and in the hands of pilots who lacked the years of training and experience of their predecessors. For these men, the Corsair was a nightmare. In head-on encounters, the Zero's agility was irrelevant. Before they could close for a turn fight, Corsairs would dive or climb past them, guns flashing, leaving burning wreckage in their wake. Combat reports from 1945 describe engagements where entire Japanese formations were destroyed in minutes, often without a single American loss. The unequal duels underscored a grim truth. Japan had not only lost the technological race, but also the human reserve of skilled airmen that had once made its machines formidable. At Okinawa, beginning in April 1945, the Corsairs' role expanded again. The battle was not only for the island, but for control of the seas around it, seas threatened daily by waves of kamikaze aircraft. The Corsair became a critical shield, fast enough to intercept incoming attackers and armed heavily enough to cut them from the sky. It stood between the suicide squadrons and the vulnerable fleets offshore. Accounts from the campaign describe Corsair pilots plunging into formations of kamikazes, firing until their barrels glowed, knowing that even one enemy breaking through could mean a ship lost and hundreds of lives extinguished. Their success did not eliminate the danger, but it blunted the edge of Japan's last desperate tactic. The versatility of the Corsair continued to shine. In addition to air defense, its rugged design made it a close support workhorse. On Okinawa's ridges and ravines, Marines fought against some of the most fanatical resistance of the war, and they called time and again for Corsairs to silence entrenched artillery or torch cave openings. Pilots flew multiple sorties each day, shifting seamlessly between air superiority patrols and ground attack runs. In the eyes of those on the ground, the Corsair became as essential as artillery or naval gunfire, a presence that reassured embattled infantry that the skies and the firepower within them were firmly on their side. Even abroad, the Corsair's reputation carried weight. German observers, receiving reports of American fighters ranging freely over Japan's home islands, recognized in them a symbol of industrial might they themselves could not equal. For the Axis powers, these aircraft represented more than a tactical threat. They were evidence of a strategic reality, that the Allies' factories, designs, and logistics had produced machines capable of sweeping aside even the most vaunted weapons of the early war. By the summer of 1945, as Corsairs escorted B-29 bombers over the Japanese homeland itself, the transformation was complete. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, had become little more than a target, swatted from the sky before it could mount a challenge. The Corsair stood as both cause and symbol of that reversal, its dominance sealing the fate of Japan's air arm. In the span of 3 years, fear had turned to mastery, and the war in the air had come full circle. The bent-wing bird, once doubted for its flaws, now embodied the triumph of adaptation, production, and relentless resolve. When the war in the Pacific finally ended in August 1945, the Corsair's record spoke with clarity. The bent-wing bird that had once stumbled onto carrier decks and raised doubts in the minds of Navy testers had finished the conflict as one of the most lethal fighters of the era. Pilots credited it with over 2,100 confirmed aerial victories for the loss of just 189 in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio of more than 11-1. These numbers were not merely statistics. They were testimony to the transformation of a design once considered flawed into a weapon that embodied Allied mastery of the skies. Its reputation endured long after the last Zero fell. The Corsair became a benchmark for what fighter aircraft could achieve when speed, firepower, and survivability were blended with relentless industrial production. Its 650 caliber guns and heavy armor proved that durability need not come at the cost of effectiveness. Where Japan's Zero had relied on fragility to gain agility, the Corsair demonstrated that brute horsepower and rugged construction could not only survive but dominate. For Japan, this was the bitterest lesson of all, that the gamble of sacrificing protection for maneuverability had paid dividends in 1941 but led to disaster as the war lengthened and American technology surged. Ahead, the Corsair's legacy extended beyond the Second World War. Retained in U.S. service, it flew again in the Korean War, this time in a world transformed by jet fighters. Against MiGs, the Corsair no longer competed in speed, but its sturdy frame and adaptability gave it a new role as a ground attack workhorse. Armed with bombs, rockets, and napalm, it struck bridges, convoys, and entrenched positions, showing that the qualities that had made it a terror in dogfights, ruggedness, range, and stability, made it equally valuable in a new conflict. Other nations, including Britain, France, and even Japan's post-war forces, operated Corsairs into the 1950s, a remarkable afterlife for a design born before 1940. Its influence touched the next generation of fighters. Engineers studying its service concluded that survivability, climb, and firepower could not be overlooked in favor of elegance alone. Though jets would dominate the post-war sky, the lessons of the Corsair carried into doctrines that emphasized versatility and resilience. For pilots who had flown it, the Corsair remained more than a machine. It was a trusted partner that had pulled them through some of the most desperate encounters of the war. Many spoke of its ability to take damage and still bring them home, its bent wings etched forever in memory as the shape of salvation. Today, the Corsair stands preserved in museums and memorials, its silhouette instantly recognizable to aviation enthusiasts and veterans alike. It symbolizes not only technological triumph, but the broader arc of the Pacific War itself, the shift from early shock and near defeat to adaptation, resurgence, and eventual dominance. The gull-winged fighter that once startled Japanese pilots into disbelief became the enduring emblem of how innovation, mass production, and determination could overturn the odds of war. Its story lingers in the historical record as a reminder that the path to victory was forged not only in battles won, but in machines that embodied the spirit of adaptation. In the humid skies of 1943, above the jungled ridges and turquoise waters of the Solomons, Japanese pilots first looked upward and felt the future bearing down upon them. They had entered combat certain of their mastery, confident that the Zero's spirals and climbs would always shake pursuit. But on that day, when the bent wings of an American fighter rose higher, closing the gap where the Zero faltered, something deeper than a tactical edge was lost. The sight of the Corsair ascending into the clouds was not just the loss of a duel, it was the loss of inevitability. In the stunned eyes of those pilots, disbelief took hold, the first shadow of defeat drawn across the sky. That shadow lengthened with every campaign that followed. The Corsair's climb mirrored the ascent of Allied strength: Guadalcanal, Bougainville, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Okinawa. Each step brought the war closer to Japan itself, each flight of gull-winged fighters marking another rung in the ladder of American ascendancy. For the Japanese, the war became a descent into exhaustion, their tactics unraveling, their young recruits flying machines no longer equal to the task. What began as disbelief hardened into resignation, as even courage could not offset the imbalance of technology and production. For the Americans, the transformation was the opposite. The fear that had gripped them in 1941 gave way to a confidence born not of arrogance but of trust, in their machines, in their industry, in the men who flew beside them. The Corsair was the vessel of that trust, proof that the tide could be turned, that the hunter could become the hunted. Every climb into the sun was a declaration that the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan alone. In the end, the story of the Corsair is the story of the war itself. Battles are shaped by valor and skill, but victory belongs to those who adapt, who harness technology, and who sustain the will to fight. The Corsair's dominance was not merely a triumph of machine over machine. It was the triumph of an industrial nation over an empire stretched beyond its means. In the final, fleeting glances of Japanese pilots as they watched the gull-winged predator rise beyond their reach, the entire arc of the conflict was written in shock, in speed, and in the irreversible certainty that the sky had shifted forever.